So in this video, we are going to take 7 minutes to talk about 7 important things to know about child support. This is the unedited version, so I am just pressing start now to get through our 7 points in 7 minutes. So point number 1 related to child support. What is the purpose of child support? Well, the reality is, even for parents who live together under the same roof, we all have an obligation to provide financially for our children's basic needs, like food, shelter, and clothing. And that obligation continues when parents live in separate homes. And each parent then has a continued obligation to provide financially for their children in accordance with the income that's available to them to do so, which brings us to point number 2. Child support is calculated based on your before tax income. This means, as a starting point, you can look at your previous year's income tax return on line 150000, I think is the right number of zeros, and it will tell you what your before tax income was. Keep in mind, though, that different income can be treated differently under the federal child support guidelines. And this brings us to point number 3, which is it's important to talk to a lawyer about anything connected to the law, but certainly when it comes to just confirming that you're using the right income for the purposes of setting child support. So, for example, somebody who is self-employed or earns dividends through a corporation, well, their real income is going to look a bit different than what that line 15000 line says. If you work in a profession that requires you to be a member of a union, your union fees are going to be taken into consideration to reduce the amount of income that's available to you for the purposes of calculating child support. And there are other instances that require some legal input. Like, for example, what do you do if your income is non-taxable to start off with? So get independent legal advice to help you understand what the appropriate amount of child support should be based on an appropriate income being attributed to you. Okay, now we're at point number 4, and that is here in Canada, we use the federal child support guidelines to tell us what the child support obligation is. And there are a few things that you need to put into the formula in order to know what the right amount is. So we just talked about your income. That's going to be one of the required inputs, but it's also is where you live as the payor of child support, plus the number of children that you have. Because somebody who lives in Saskatchewan will pay a different amount for the same number of children than somebody who lives in a different province. Point number 5 to know about child support, and that is your parenting arrangement will also influence the outcome of the child support calculations. If your children spend relatively equal amount of time in each household, then each parent's income is relevant and child support has to be set for each parent. Now, if both parents are making pretty much the same amount of money, then that's going to net out to 0. But if parents have an equal shared parenting arrangement, that's defined by each parent having the children in their care for at least 40% of the time, then each parent's income is used and each parent has a child support obligation. And if one parent earns a lot more money than the other parent, then the difference in the obligation is the net amount that the higher income earner will pay. Now, this brings us to point number 6 to know about child support, and that is that there are other expenses that will come into play that you have an obligation and a privilege to contribute to over and above the monthly child support. So even in a situation where the child might live full time in one parent's house, and therefore that person's income isn't relevant to calculate a monthly child support payment to the other parent, because they don't have to make a child support payment to the other parent. They're contributing to the children in their care on a full-time basis, providing for food, shelter, and clothing. Even in that instance, we actually need to know that parent's income, because the federal child support guidelines contemplate these extra expenses that will come up when we have children, such as the costs of childcare, the costs of dental care, other medical needs if you have a shortfall after applying your benefit plan, the costs of education, and the costs of extracurricular activities. Now, each family will have a different list of things that they would like to share between them. The law says it's appropriate to share those expenses proportionate to income. And when parents don't agree, there are some details that are set out in the federal child support guidelines to help you determine whether it's a legitimate Section 7 expense or not. However, once you've reached an agreement or looked to the legislation for guidance, that's just the beginning part of figuring out what extra expenses there are. You will now then need to figure out a protocol around who is going to be the first payor, and how does the reimbursement or the contribution from the other parent get applied, what's the time frame, what information needs to be exchanged, such as receipts, and what information needs to be shared in advance before the costs are committed to. All right, now our final thing to note about child support, and that is that child support is something that gets reviewed on an annual basis. And that is our 7 minutes. And if you have some more questions about child support, put your questions in the comments below, or feel free to send me an email directly, cpanko@commonsenselawyer.com.